How does this impact my democratic rights? And is my vote once every 4 or 5 years of any value? Does it have any worth?
We have the technology for it. If I vote for a certain party that has indeed gone into government, and if I feel like none of their promises are being held, how come I can't remove my vote?
People like Musk are now trillionaires. How does that stop them? During austerity. So in 2000, there were 15 billionaires in the UK. How many do you think there are now?
What do you feel are the kind of changes which are absolutely necessary to rebalance this power?
HSBC was born, literally, look this up, literally as a British capitalist corporation in Far East Asia, built to launder the money that was made from the opium trade.
With the knockout of Nord Stream, their energy prices went up 4x, and German industry has been in recession ever since. Volkswagen announced the closure or imminent closure of a number of their plants. This has never happened in the history of Germany.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective. We often hear about isms of all kinds: socialism, communism, capitalism. Of course, there are other ideologies across our globe today which we regularly hear referred to on the news. And all too often, first of all, we don't even know actually what they mean. One of those I'm going to probably cite is neoliberalism, arguably the most important and most influential and the most kind of pervasive ideology on the planet today, one which the most powerful and the most rich establishments in the world essentially promote and push and deliver in one shape or form, not only on a state level, but also through transnational corporations. So first of all, I want to just explore in this program this whole notion of neoliberalism and its impact, particularly on what's regarded as a socialist society. There are all sorts of debates amongst the academics and amongst the philosophers around the impact of neoliberalism. But on a very basic level, we know that Margaret Thatcher here in Britain particularly was a great advocate, and we saw subsequently the Labour Party also pretty much adopted under Tony Blair. What are the consequences of neoliberalism? How has it turned out? What is the impact of this ideology on the world? And perhaps, for an example, perhaps Europe is our focal point. With me to go through this countercultural expression of a look at neoliberalism and its impact, in the studio I have Khalid Mahmood-Chohan, who's he was the prospective parliamentary candidate standing for the Workers' Party in the previous elections. Also a businessman, worked in the City of London for many, many years. Welcome to the show, Khalid.
Thank you, Martin.
And with us also we have Joao Silva Jordao from Lisbon today, joining us to discuss this whole impact, particularly on the socialist scene across Europe perhaps and beyond. Joao, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. Welcome. Thank you.
Joao himself is a political analyst, but also, I think, an architectural planner par excellence, as we've seen before on other programs. But thank you for joining us, gentlemen. I'm going to start really with Khalid. Khalid, you've worked in the City of London. You've seen at close quarters the impact of neoliberalism, the emphasis on privatization, the empowering of large corporations, and then its kind of collision course, often, as I see it, with socialism and a lot of the values of society as we knew it, certainly with the old hard left, as many would perhaps view them today. And there were huge contrasts from the very outset of its emergence across Europe and certainly in Britain. Give us your overview, of how you feel that's worked out.
Yeah, thank you, Moses. Neoliberalism, it's bandied about quite a lot, but we lived through it. So it all kind of started in the 1980s. In the UK, Margaret Thatcher came to power. Her coming to power in the UK coincided with a chap called Ronald Reagan, and they turned upside down what had been the post-war consensus. And if you look at the post-war consensus, it was very much about, soldiers coming back, they had skills, providing good jobs for them, those jobs paid well, and people, ordinary workers, became more and more empowered. workers' organizations were encouraged. You had the workers' organizations actually having members on the board of German companies. All of this was, like a social compact. Neoliberalism came along and said, no, that's not what it's all about. The market is everything. The market is king, right? So you had this incredible focus on the market being the corrective process for everything. Yeah. So therefore, you had to strip away any impediment to market forces, to corporate whims and desires. If labor organizations got in the way, they had to be done away with. If legal processes got in the way, they had to be done away with. If infrastructure or anything else got in the way of what corporations wanted to, they had to be done away. And that was the essential of neoliberalism. And they came up with, there were no load of economic terms like the Chicago School and the Vienna School. It was all basically the same stuff that they were all peddling, which was the market is king. However, what has it achieved? In the 1970s, the average CEO's salary was about, in the UK, about 25, 26 times the average worker's salary. In the US, it was probably a little bit more than that, but round about that multiple. Fast forward neoliberalism, nowadays the CEO's salary is hundreds, thousands of times more than the average worker in that same organization. So you have a huge concentration. If you look at the overall economy and the wealth owned by the people talk about the 1%. Let's talk about the 0.01%. In 1970, the 0.01% accounted for 2% of the wealth of the US. I would imagine the figures for the UK are roughly about the same. In 2010, the 0.01% owned 11%. So you have a massive concentration of wealth, all arising from neoliberalism. And if you look at how that has happened, well, it's happened because all the social compact, all the laws that were in place to try and equalize were stripped away. And when you strip these away, what you don't get is a free market. You get a market that is freely exploited for monopolistic and oligopolistic purposes.
Right. Well, this is a great scene setting. If you didn't know about neoliberalism, and I find actually secular neoliberalism is a term which is basically something which is almost a blind spot. Most people, we did a survey of the average person across Britain and asked them, what is neoliberalism? I am pretty sure that you will get a negligible level of real understanding of what it is, what it stands for, and how heavily it impacts lives. But to play devil's advocate, I could say, look, poverty around the world is reducing. They say, neoliberals say, that we've reduced poverty around the world. We've, increased economic wealth. So contrary to Khalid's argument, they'll say there's a trickle-down effect. We create wealth. These really wealthy people create wealth, and that wealth that they generate through their whatever they do to do that actually ends up ultimately benefiting the person at the bottom. Joao, what's your take? You've followed not just neoliberalism, but then the impact on society and socialism as a concept. What's your take, and how do you react to this phenomena?
Thank you, Mohsen. Let me just make a comment on what you just said now. It is true. I think one of the best metrics for the evolution of, the economy and the state of politics in the last decades is just the explosion of how many human beings exist. There's 8 billion people on the planet, and that is to a certain degree. I wouldn't call it necessarily. I think capitalists will always try to take the merit and say, look, we live under capitalism. Therefore, we see effectively, I wouldn't say so much a reduction of poverty, because poverty will always be relative. Poverty a lot of times will just be measuring your purchasing power. But it is true that we have, generally speaking, over the last decades, dropping rates of infant mortality, a rising age of mortality. So people live more and longer and die less. That is true. But we cannot put that down to capitalism by itself. Some of it is just technological development. So, for example, the Soviet Union, now again, by no means am I a communist, But the Soviet Union also will have seen a huge increase in its technological capacity, and by no means was it being run by a capitalist socioeconomic system. So we cannot say that capitalism itself is the only driving force behind some of the positive metrics that we may have seen, generally speaking, in the world. Me, for example, even though I am part of a party that's called the Socialist Party, but I consider myself to be a social democrat. There's something that's really missing a lot of times for reasons that we can go into, which is an analysis of so-called social democracy. We do not live, now we do live under a sort of specter and rule of neoliberal economic policy, as you would say. But we can also say that in the West, generally speaking, we live under something closer to a sort of social democratic entente. Okay, so with a social democratic entente, which is basically a sort of understanding between socialism or communism and capitalism. And it's really important to understand that now, if we do say that we still live under social democracy, very, very clearly, it's a social democracy that's increasingly going towards capitalism and capitalist excesses. But that's not a good thing, that's a negative thing. And the absolute epitome of that is the United States of America. Let's keep it mainly at a European analysis, but the United States of America shows what happens when you have a roughly social democratic system that tends more towards capitalism. That is to say, they don't really have the best metrics when it comes to education. But who does? Social democratic countries, for example, in Northern Europe, that are much more actual social democracies. When you have people like Bernie Sanders, bursting into the scene of US politics, he won't say he wants socialism. A lot of his support base will say, hey, let's have something more like a social democracy. And what they really mean is that they want policies that combat the excesses of capitalism. So capitalism, and especially under its form of like neoliberalism, is an absolute excess that does what? Tries to break the social democratic consensus, which appeared why? It's really important to understand why. It is because in the post-Second War, the post-Second World War period, especially in Europe, there were key concessions that were made by the political establishment and the bourgeoisie of Europe, that were made to the working classes. Why? Because of the specter of a sort of communist revolution, which happened across the board, certainly happened in Portugal. And one of the best examples is the United Kingdom. Post-Second World War, you had Winston Churchill standing for election. Imagine, he could claim, I am the bastion of British courage. Give me the position of prime minister. Guess what? The British people chose Attlee. Why? Because he promised the foundation of the NHS. This isn't capitalism. This is the people being given, because they had power of labor unions and the specter of potential communist revolutions in Europe and all over the world, meant that the bourgeoisie said, hey, wait a second, we have to step back and we have to use our sort of base of taxation to give something back to the people, namely basic healthcare, basic security, and some degree of worker rights. So we have to look at when capitalists say that, look, we've done so well, reduction of poverty, it is not by merely the effect of, yes, capitalism's relative capacity to, anyone will say that capitalism as a system does one thing fairly well, which is it coerces people into working, because if you don't work, you'll starve to death. So, it's a mechanism which gets people kind of working. Yeah, kind of, sure. But without proper balances, none of those benefits will go to the people. And the other side of it, just as a final commentary, before we go into the how the left has now given up this sort of bargaining power that it used to have post-Second World War. The other side of the coin is that you cannot possibly, and this is something that is so cynical, which is people, for example, again, I'm not necessarily a communist, but when they criticize radical or more left-wing politics, they'll say, look how many people communism has killed. Communism has left in its wake millions and tens of millions and hundreds, why not billions of death? They always come up with these ridiculous numbers. You have to say, okay, that's very interesting. But now let's look at how capitalism was born, bred, grew, and indeed solidified itself as a sort of potent force, again, in the more or less social democratic system which we have, which is more and more being marked by capitalist imbalance and this neoliberal policies that you speak of. You have to look at how modern capitalism was born on the corpses of millions of people. What is the best example I have for you? The best example I have. What is one of the biggest British banks that you have in the world, in Europe, and in the UK? It's HSBC. What does HSBC stand for? The Hong Kong HS, it's the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. Do you know another corporation that if you go, for example, in any big port in Europe, you'll see P&O Cruises. Now, what if I told you that HSBC, you can look this up, as ridiculous as this may seem, but it is true. And this is one of the main ways to see how this is proper capitalism without labor coming in, proper labor, not the Labor Party, but without proper labor being organized. This is what you get when you let capitalism run rampant. They will literally traffic drugs and put up corporations to launder that money. And one of the best examples is HSBC. I don't know if you remember, there was this big hoorah in the media some years ago. And the media was like, oh, the shocking findings that HSBC has been involved in laundering of money and helping people not pay taxes. And I was looking at these stories and I was like, wow, that is pretty bad. But nothing in compared to how it was actually born. HSBC was born literally, look this up, literally as a British capitalist corporation in Far East Asia, built to launder the money that was made from the opium trade. This is capitalism. It's the pure, unbridled capitalism is the British establishment waging war on the Chinese people, literally bombing their ports because China was trying to stop British imports of opium into China. This is capitalism. And then the precursor to P&O Cruises setting up a parallel institution to launder the huge amounts of money that were being made by this is pure capitalist British enterprise in Far East Asia saying, no, you do not get to block our imports. And that led to what we now know as a so-called century of humiliation that China has never forgotten and will never forget. And there's a large part of what motivates their new sort of impulse to strength and defense, because they never want to be humiliated in that way again. So we really have to, when capitalists say, oh, this explosion of wealth, by no means should we abstain from saying, okay, sure, to some degree, it is under the perhaps a sort of capitalist regime that we've had a growth of industry, even maybe international trade. But the other side of the coin is what happens when you live under capitalism proper. And just to give you another example, what was one of the main goals of the 2001 that we now understand fully what the game plan was? What was one of the main goals behind invading Afghanistan in 2001? It was to replant opium growth in Afghanistan. And what's happened since? Because the Taliban, I despise the Taliban as a political force, but they did indeed manage to limit the growth of poppy plants and a growth of the prime kind of material for opium. And what's happened since, and this is what you get with unbridled capitalism, is the countries themselves that will say that they champion capitalism in order for the people to be free. They will enslave other people, invade other countries in highly corrupt military operations to get their international drug trade again, a drug trade that will ultimately backfire and enslave their own population. So look at what happens when you let capitalism run free. This is what you get. You get wars for
very
profit.
very powerful argument, and I think it sounds very well evidenced. But the area I want to explore, Khalid, and Joao started alluding it, and you touched on it as well, is there's this kind of murky relationship between state apparatus and transnational corporations, which seems to be coming through both of your narratives. It strikes me as a lay individual looking at this. I know about the East India Company, and perhaps that was the first transnational corporation actually which worked with the sovereign, with the crown, the British crown, and perhaps that was the template which really was the precursor to modern day hyper-capitalist transnational corporate state axis of manipulation, perhaps. That's what I guess I'm getting from you guys. But I guess these forces will turn back and say, look, without us, without this system, the whole world will collapse. The heavens will come down if you dare to even challenge this. And yet the implications of it for ordinary people seem absolutely huge. But yet people seem so unable to even fathom how that mechanism works. In a democracy, in a society where we're supposed to be politically educated and we're supposed to be able to, generate our own destiny as a social, as a social unit, it seems awfully disempowering if we don't even know about the relationship of the most powerful and most important financial and political, phenomena that controls us. So tell us how we got to that stage where we don't know about these fundamental structures and how they operate, and do we have any control over them is the question.
I think the key to this, and I agree with all of the situation that Joao spoke about. In fact, when that HSBC Mexican drug money laundering situation happened, I was having a meeting with some other banking execs in a tower block literally across the square from HSBC's.
Right.
And we were, my team and I were obviously talking to them about anti-money laundering solutions, software to prevent those kind of fines being levied on their organization. And when they sort of broached the subject and they said, "Oh, you probably know why we've invited you here to, talk to us." And I said, "Are you worried about what's happening to the neighbours?" It was HSBC Tower. And to break the ice, they were all very serious. It was all very serious people. And I said, "If you're worried about what's happened to the neighbours, it's just in their DNA." And it took a few seconds before everybody joined up the dots back to what Joao was saying, that HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, was the drug dealers' bank. It was the opium laundering bank established in the waterfront in Shanghai, where the building still exists, by the way. That's a great example. But what going fast forward to your situation here, you had a sort of rampant capitalism, yes, where the monarchs were part of the East India Company and the West Africa Company, which gave us slavery and the genocide of huge African populations. I think 11 million people were actually offloaded, according to insurance records, were offloaded in the West Indies. And if you take an average death rate on the voyages, the death rate diminished massively over the course of slavery because they got better at making them survive. It was profit. But, it went from sort of like over 50% died in the early days to about a loss of only about 10% in the later years. So if you say, a death rate of, somewhere around 50% on average, that gives you 22 million people who got onto the boats. And before they got onto the boats, they were frog marched from the African interior, where that was called the March of Death. So forget the voyage, the March of Death was. So if you then double up again, I mean, you're talking astronomical numbers, 50 million. I mean, all right, let's say we got it completely wrong and it was half that. That is the human misery there. So you can see what rampant capitalism does, absolutely. But as you fast forward, I agree with Zhao's analysis there. That post-war, there was a different compact. Capitalism reined in to try and provide significant gains for ordinary workers, and that situation continued. Then we fast forward to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was an attempt to completely turn the clock back to almost sort of like feudal baron type capitalism. And you can see that's exactly the effect that it's had. So from that point, the clock started going back. You see the dismantlement of labor organizations. You see the legal process changing. Laws are passed. And we talk about how did it happen. It happened, first of all, through capture of academic institutions. So you had, people being fed through so-called economics degrees in, top business schools and and so forth, and they were fed this kind of neoliberal economic theory, the so-called Chicago, the monetarist theory. There's lots of names for it, And it feeds off this notion that, when it became apparent that all it was doing was leading to a concentration of wealth, they then started peddling these ideas that, it's trickle-down economics, because they wanted the ordinary person in the street to think, well, it's a good thing. The person's getting rich, and as they make more money, they will open more businesses, etc., etc. And it's also predicated on an economic theory that says that the more of something you have, it has diminishing marginal utility, right? Which says that, if you've got 1 car, 2 cars, 3 cars, after a while you just get fed up with cars, and they applied it to money in the same way, that said the more money you have has diminishing marginal utility, and therefore you start to, trickle down. Well, there's some great work being done by, I think, one of the probably, in my opinion, the greatest living economist in the Western world is a guy called Professor Michael Hudson. And he has proven that greed is actually addictive. So fundamentally, it doesn't trickle down. They keep getting greedier and greedier and greedier. So you have more and more concentration. And you can only see this now, where you have, people like Musk are now trillionaires. How does that stop them? You've got people like, Bezos, a billion, but, getting close to trillionaires. Yeah, and you have a situation where during austerity, right? So in 2000, there were 15 billionaires in the UK. How many do you think there are now? At the last count, it was a couple of years ago, the figures I got.
A few thousand?
Not quite a few thousand. Bear in mind, there were only 15.
Okay, yeah, that's...
15 to a few thousand is a big jump, right?
Based on what you were saying earlier, it's like, clearly there's been a huge expansion, yeah.
But 171, right? So at a time when the economy grew by 0.15%, 0.15, the number of billionaires grew by 6x. How can that possibly happen? Where is the money coming from? Because the economy isn't growing enough to create the additional wealth for those people to become billionaires. So they are de facto sucking the wealth from everybody else. And this is what happens. The more concentration you get, the more concentrated it gets. And there are a number of processes, all now clearly documented. And the first of these is political capture. Political capture says that when people become so financially powerful, they start to buy political parties. They buy political influence. They do it in all kinds of ways that are legalized. You get politicians through a revolving door, will do somebody a favor, and then guess what? As soon as they retire, they get non-executive directors.
So this brings in what I was asking about in terms of the relationship between the state and this kind of transnational corporate fraternity. And of course, if it's money that controls everything and privatization is what is king, then the media itself is subject to that. So the other factor, other than the banksters and say the politicians, the other most powerful and influential set of institutions is the media alongside academia, which serves them as well. It all sounds like it could very easily be sewn up because money drives all of these institutions. They all hanker for it. That would arguably compromise their independence as institutions, which are meant to work in the interests of the public. But do we have a situation now where any of these institutions are really working in the interests of the public?
Well, the institutions are very heavily compromised. If you look at how universities work, they work on an endowment basis. So all of the degrees, I mean, if somebody started to come up with a degree that said, actually, neoliberalism fails, they're not going to fund it.
Really? It just wouldn't be...
They won't get the endowments. I mean, this is as simple as that. And if you look at in terms of the political sphere, any time somebody appears that has some genuinely different view, and Jeremy Corbyn is a classic case. He was presented as some kind of, first of all, they tried to present him as some kind of foaming at the mouth radical. His policies were to the right of Edward, Heath.
Wow.
Who was the Conservative Prime Minister.
To the
Corbyn's
right of
policies
Edward
were
Heath.
to the right of Edward Heath.
That's amazing.
So it is quite ludicrous to describe it. So then, when that attack sort of failed, what they did was they came up with this, racist slur about anti-Semitism when only some Jewish voices were allowed to speak. The Jewish Voice for Labour, which is a huge organisation, a large number of Jewish people, very big supporters of Corbyn. Half of them were pilloried by the Labour Party. Jewish people were found to be anti-Semitic. So,
Yes.
You can see this capture happening, political capture, you got the educational capture, and then you have the media capture, because it all has to happen in concert. Because how is it that nobody asked any questions about why this was happening? How is it that somebody who has got the most powerful anti-racist credentials over a decades and decades long political career is suddenly being pilloried as a racist? How is that not a single media voice stepped out of line? And that is the same situation. And now you have BBC journalists, for example, talking about the Palestine and Gaza situation, where they are being literally frog marched down a particular line of commentary. And you have the same thing about the economic situation in the West during the Russia-Ukraine war.
Okay, I'm going to hold you. Some fascinating realities really hitting hard home. And I'm kind of questioning now, first of all, the notion of democracy. Because, Joao, if we have a situation where institutions are so influenced by this kind of hyper-capitalist system, the question I, as a lay person, would have to ask is, how does this impact my democratic rights? And is my vote once every 4 or 5 years of any value? Does it have any worth, given that there could be very powerful financial forces, economic forces, transnational corporations that are very much inside the political system, compromising it to the point where my voice is virtually pointless? Whatever I voted for doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be manifested. Is democracy alive in the West under a neoliberal canopy?
I think, I wouldn't necessarily be brave enough to try and measure how much our vote counts. But what I would say is that however much it counts, it's decreasing in value for a bunch of different reasons. So one of them is because of what we've been discussing here. So the center left, as bad as it was before, is getting worse. So that means that the so-called parties that are likely to be elected on the left are much and much and much less, almost every week that passes, much less of a positive alternative for people to actually make a positive change in their lives. And then there's another thing, and we can go back to the socioeconomic. I would like to just make a note here before we go into the issue of elections, that even capitalism is preparing itself for a sort of post-consumer capitalism, where it's getting ready, one, for a situation where the people have a less and less purchasing power. And so they're trying to sort of develop a business-to-business model where they can still survive in a situation where people have less purchasing power, and themselves are not only having their purchasing power diminishing in relation to that huge and growing imbalance that Khalid was talking about, but also for a future where people will be less and less necessary, first and foremost because of the advent of industry, which kind of debased a little bit the value of manual labor, and now obviously the advent of not only robots, but an artificial intelligence, which may not completely destroy, but reduce the need for intellectual labor as well. So that is really a scary time. So imagine a situation where a person like me that tends to be on the left is now looking at people like Ford, who had the old kind of adage, let's try to pay laborers enough so that they can make enough to buy our cars. Imagine people like me on the left looking at capitalists like Ford and seeing them as relative kind of moderate examples of perhaps what a socioeconomic system would look like. That's how bad it's getting. But going back to the question of voting, there's obviously a couple of factors that we have to discuss. So first, I've already mentioned it, the absolute corruption of the center left, which has always been pretty bad, but is getting worse and worse and worse. Let me give you a little example just to kind of, and because we're going to try and focus a little bit on UK politics. So before, the center left was always trying to, the center left used to be part of the international, as it were, and was always talking about international solidarity. Now the center left, and some of its, Tony Blair being a particularly bad example, but even, for example, if you look at Keir Starmer, look at the change going from we are center left, let's try and make trade unions and engage in international solidarity. That's being replaced by international butchery. I don't know if you saw the Keir Starmer, the absolutely despicable statement that Keir Starmer, part of who's part of the Labour Party. I think the name kind of matters. At some point, if you belong to the Labour Party, you should be looking to defend the rights of the working class, if not in the UK, then all over the world. He said in the UK military base, in reference, and I'm quoting the Evening Standard no less, not some conspiracy theory website, in reference to some of the sensitive work conducted from the base by the UK military in its Cyprus base, although we're really proud of what you're doing, we can't necessarily tell the world what you're doing here. Well, we know what they're doing. They're spy planes. No country has sent more spy missions over Gaza than the United Kingdom under a Labour government during a genocide. This is the reality of the center left nowadays. If you think Tony Blair was bad, this is potentially even worse. They've driven these wars underground. And look at the choice of words. Even though we are proud of what you're doing, namely gathering intelligence and giving key logistical support to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, we can't necessarily tell the world what you're doing here, but we know what you're doing. And you just basically told us what you're doing. You're engaging in aiding and abetting and indeed profiteering from genocide. Let's go back to some of the factors that are reducing the power of people's votes. One of them is technocracy. So you will have noticed that whenever people talk about democracy, it's really important to actually, instead of just say, oh, but we have elections, we can elect a president, we can elect a prime minister. In your case, you elect a prime minister. Here in Portugal, we have, legislative for the prime minister, then we elect the president. It's all very fair and well. But you have to look at the sectors of society that are under the strict governance of parliament. And what you're seeing is more and more of the key decisions being made by technocratic institutions. Let me give you an example. Do people in England elect who is going to be the head of the Bank of England? Absolutely not. Those things are not liable to election or to vote. I mean, obviously in the United Kingdom, you have even more complicated situations. You have the Crown, obviously not liable to voting. You have the City of London, which has a sort of a corporate type of limited democracy amongst themselves, where corporations get to vote. But even if you're just looking at, His Majesty's government, how much power do they have really, and how much of the sectors of society are being pulled away from their power? You don't only have the Bank of England. You have obviously cartels. You have corporate cartels. You have less and less. For example, look, how many corporations are there that provide the food that we buy in the supermarket? And then when you go into, for example, let's look at the institutions linked to government that are supposed to be, in America, you have the FDA. How many of them are, a lot of them are appointed by government officials. Sure, okay. But how much power do we have really? If tomorrow we figure out that the authority is meant to police health, the safety of our food, the safety of our water, if tomorrow we figure out there are huge scandals of corruption, what do we do really? Well, we actually have to wait for 2, 3, 4 years for the next election, hoping that we can elect someone who will then put pressure on them. I mean, it's just a completely convoluted system whereby more often than not, it's ruled by council. This is what we really have to understand. We are not ruled as much by parliamentary democracy as we think we are. We're ruled by council and by selection as opposed to election. And another thing, even if you figure out, okay, well, we only have about anywhere from 30 to 70%, if you're going to be really generous, of our society's key issues which are under the direct jurisdiction of the parliament. Well, why don't we have systems whereby people can, a year in, 2 years in, remove their vote? We have the technology for it. If I vote for a certain party that has indeed gone into government, and if I feel like none of their promises are being held, how come I can't remove my vote? Let me give you another example just to finish. We have had experiments, even though they don't always work, with things like participatory budgeting. I could have my municipality, let's say, give 10 to 20% of money to something that is decided by the people. You can say mistakes will be made. Logistically, it's very complicated. But what definitely is happening is we live under a form of government which is in no way, shape, or form investing in the civic education and participation of the people. Instead, they seem to be investing completely in the other way, which is putting more and more arenas of our society under technocratic rule, ruling by council, by leaders that are selected and not elected, and then obviously investing in the sort of huge mechanism of alienation which the people are unfortunately kind of being enveloped by.
Okay.
So to answer your question very directly, I think we should by no means abdicate on the power of vote. We obviously have to, because it's a little bit dangerous to tell people that their vote is worth nothing, yeah, because then they're going to become all the more alienated. But I think what we can safely say is however much our vote counts, it is starting to count and matter less and less. And that's what we need to counter. We need to look at specific measures, participatory budgeting, the removal of votes. We need to look into mechanisms where our vote is worth more and more. And we need to have a very very, very serious discussion regarding what part of our lives really need to be ruled by a sort of technocratic expertise rather than by mechanisms that we can actually interact with in a democratic way. And again, we have the technology for it. The internet, for example, we could dedicate a whole episode on the potential of the internet to go either way. And increasingly, do you think the internet is being used more and more as a tool to make people actually participate actively and affect the institutions of government? Or perhaps the opposite? Is it being more used as a surveillance tool, as a censorship tool? It's a really important. So we have to get down to actually specifics. And I think still starting from the consensus that however much our vote counts, unfortunately, it's counting for less and less. And we need to counter that.
Well, really riveting stuff. Oligarchy comes to mind. The word oligarchy as a mechanism of rule seems to be increasingly very apparent from your arguments. I think I love the idea of solutions now, and I think that's what we have to turn to, because the symptoms of neoliberal, if you like, totalitarianism or surveillance capitalism seems to be increasingly there for anybody who wants to see the evidence. It seems it's there, and of course it gives huge power. There is a huge amount of power, not just because of the information technology at the disposal of these forces now, but of course now there's data as well. And I think, Khalid, you're a data expert, of course, and you also recognise this danger of power accumulating at the top more and more, the accumulation of wealth at the top, and the divide becoming more and more, if you like, significantly, dangerous, I would say. So solutions, Joao started positing some solutions. On mainstream media, I don't hear this discourse. I don't hear any discussion about criticizing the established order. Again, probably for the reasons that you mentioned in your previous answer about the relationship between the media and the academia and the political circles and these banking and transnational corporations. Hardly any surprise that there isn't a discussion, but we're going to have that discussion. And let's dedicate the rest of the program to saying, okay, how do you feel? What do you feel are the kind of changes that are which are absolutely necessary to rebalance this power which is accumulating at the top via neoliberalism and its kind of its rampant expansion?
I think the first thing is that you cannot have a vote that is meaningful without everybody being adequately informed. So when you have capture of the media, when you have political capture, when you have capture of educational institutions, then that is a very dangerous situation, because the people that are voting with only a fraction of the information they need to make a judgment. I'll give you a classic example. There's something called the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yes, I came across it. Yep.
And the Transatlantic Partnership.
That's a step one, yeah.
And nobody, this was being negotiated entirely in secret by a bunch of appointed technocrats in Brussels,
right,
and technocrats in the US. And nobody knew what was in this process.
So nothing democratic about it.
Nothing democratic about it. I'll just give you a brief insight. What it gave transnational corporations rights in precedence to national governments. So if we as a state here in the UK, our parliament decides that for environmental purposes, we no longer want messy oil because we decide that we're going to go nuclear and it's clean and we can do it within the next 20 years, then the oil companies under the TTP regulations would have been able to sue us for the actions that we took that made them forego their profits.
Goodness me.
Other legislation creates corporations as legal entities, for example, in the US. They are legal citizens and therefore can contribute to political parties. A corporation should never be able to contribute to a political process. Yeah. Political process is by de facto of the people. But in the US, corporations are being designated as people.
Incredible.
Because they can make. So not only can the rich individuals off their own back donate money, but their corporations can also donate money to political groupings, and therefore that accelerates the rate of capture. So in terms of solutions forward, I think the first thing is awareness and an understanding of where we are. We have to break this complete vice-like grip on information, and we need channels like this and other channels to take that up and to start to chip away at that vice-like grip on information. The second area is for people to be able to organize themselves and to have a political voice that actually calls this out. For instance, if you have enough media brainwashing you, you can actually act against your own interests. A classic example, the Russia-Ukraine war. The UK has no dog in this fight. We are thousands of miles away. We're a nuclear-armed country. There is no realistic possibility at all of anyone invading us. None, zero.
Not if you hear the Western media. They'll say that it's an existential threat.
Journalists, so-called journalists, blabbering on about the imminent invasion. There's no chance. They talk about the Russian Federation invading. Well, I've flown across the Russian Federation, right, while I was on my way to Shanghai. It takes 8 hours to fly across the Russian Federation. They've only got 160 million people. They do not have enough people to defend that expanse of territory, let alone go around conquering other territories. It's not possible. So the reality is that if you look at the whole Ukraine war and our participation, yes, they do perceive a threat from a neighbor. If there's a neighbor that they see a threat from, that's understandable. And I can understand the Ukrainians' perspective as well. But we do not have a dog in the fight. So why did we choose to sanction our own cheap energy? German post-war growth was predicated on cheap and plentiful flows of Russian energy.
But Nord Stream got knocked out.
With the knockout of Nord Stream, their energy prices went up 4x, and German industry has been in recession ever since. Volkswagen announced the closure or imminent closure of a number of their plants. This has never happened in the history of Germany. Germany is deindustrializing. If you look at us, our inflation figures, we are told that inflation is running at 4 or 5%. Well, go and tell the people that are selling eggs on the supermarket shelves and milk. Those everyday commodities are double the price of what they used to be. So I think the first thing is that we need information. We need information pushed out there which challenges the sort of Orwellian narrative that is coming out from the capture of the media and the political establishment. First of all.
Well, economic ignorance is a reality. Most people are economically illiterate at the best of times, but in this case, it could mean fatality, really.
And absolutely, because, at the same time as we're told that we are undergoing this, fantastic rejuvenation, our economy is growing, and yet we're told that there's a cost of living crisis. Where does the cost of living crisis come from?
From the lack
from the sanctioning of our own energy supplies, right? And then magically they decide that because inflation has gone up, and inflation obviously was going to go up, if you put the energy costs of the people with greenhouses who are growing tomatoes, if you put their energy costs up, guess what? They're going to increase they can do nothing but increase their prices. So that caused inflation. And then guess what our government did? They put up interest rates to quell that inflation. How can that quell that inflation? Because if those people don't put their prices up, they'll go bust.
Yes. There's a survival issue.
Supply side inflation. It's not demand inflation. It's not our demand for the tomatoes that is causing the prices to go up. Yeah. It's the fact that their costs have gone up. So they put up interest rates. And in doing that, in putting up interest rates, what good did that do? Suddenly, thousands and thousands, tens of millions of homeowners, instead of paying 20-30% of their income on housing, are now paying 60-70% of their income on housing.
Well, these are just some of the. We'll continue because there's such a lot to document. But I think you've given us a fantastic flavour, Joao. We've only got 5 minutes left, so I'd like you to continue with some more thoughts on perhaps solutions to this. I mean, Khalid points to awareness, raising awareness and education of people about the economic threat that hangs over them, which they basically are pretty ignorant about and pretty helpless, or feel they'd be helpless because they're not in charge of any of the economic institutions, and the political institutions seem to be hand in glove, as we seem to have agreed. But where do you go as a first step then? Of course, there's a lot of other things that could be done. From your point of view, maybe another step or two that you could put out there as things that the public should be moving towards?
We have to have more of a sense of urgency in a bunch of different things. So when it comes to the financial aspect, we need to be asking ourselves very serious questions. So obviously, you did mention at the beginning in a sort of and you're right. So we should, I don't know if you know, it's very interesting, an old German movie called Metropolis, a 1927 movie, Metropolis. It's sort of like the last gasp of German social democracy. And in that movie, it's very interesting because there's a sort of false revolutionary movement which they portray as being satanic, which ultimately leads the workers into their own destruction. This is sort of a commentary on communism and Luddites, who would destroy machines. So I agree with your concept that we can't have a destructive approach, because effectively, if our lives today depend on the financial institutions that we disagree with, the supply chains which we know are unjust, we can't have a destructive approach to them. So we need to have a sense of urgency, and I would even say we need to be unapologetic about being more aggressive with two things, which is the building of alternative systems, which, by the way, the current systems will always even more aggressively try to put down. They'll either try to buy up your company, which to continue monopolies, or, very importantly, we need to have a higher sense of urgency and aggression when it comes to battling for political spaces. And it needs to focus on political parties. It has to be. I think in a way, we gave up, unfortunately, the fight for, for example, the Labour Party. We here in Portugal, the Socialist Party. We need to be very, very aggressive in taking back these spaces away from rabid capitalists. We need to tell them, look, if this is called the Labour Party, and I know that institutionally it's so hard because the mechanisms to police and prevent the takeover of these center-left parties from actual progressive forces are so strong, and they're nothing short of brutal and conspiratorial, but we cannot give up. We cannot give up, because if historically, for example, going back to the UK, if historically you have a party called the Labour Party, at some point, you need to tell them, no, if you are not pro-labor, you're the one that needs to leave. I know how hard this is. And the way I have to represent this, and I'll finish with this last comment, is as growing up, We've always been sort of showered with this very simplistic view whereby you have the very few evil people and then you have the noble people that will eventually be pushed to the brink and unite and then go against the powers that be. Unfortunately, when you go into actual political work, you'll find that your primary adversary will not be the people in power because you can't reach them. It will actually be what I call the battle for the arena of resistance. You will be faced by many people who pretend that they want to be the alternative, but they're really sellouts and agents of the system masquerading as alternatives. So we have to be very clear about a sense of urgency, about a sort of sense of purpose that we need to have, and adopt a higher sense of urgency when it comes to recapturing the so-called, what I call and what a lot of people call, the arena of resistance. And we need to be unapologetic, sometimes by fighting against false alternatives and people who portray themselves as sort of revolutionaries, as progressives, when they're really nothing short of agents of the system themselves. We need to be unapologetic about this, unapologetic, and we need to really look at, also, we have to look at the very class. Some of the answers have already been built for us. Surely we have to build labor unions again. We need to be pro-labor. We need to be pro-labor, and we need to have, look, in no way would, 30 years ago, if we had a sort of genocide being cast by the mainstream media, in no way would this happen as it's happening today. 20 or 30 years ago, you would have people going on general strikes that would say, in no point are we going to continue to work while little children are being killed like this. So we really need to look at old school orthodox systems, because sometimes we need novel answers, but we cannot forego orthodox normal answers such as labor unions. This is really important, I think.
Absolutely fascinating as a discussion between two very, very profound thinkers, I would say. And I think it's often the case that people who are coming from outside of the box and outside the institutions are the ones who are going to drive some kind of justice and some kind of change. I think there's a huge number of points that were raised there as to what we can do, what we should do. But it does strike me as that we've just discussed largely the economic consequences of neoliberalism and its actuality as a weapon of choice now for state and corporation based organizations. And it seems as though they are fundamentally violating the ordinary people's rights and their sort of their hard-earned rights since the 40s. This seems clear. However, the reality, of course, is that whether it's your culture, whether it's your politics, whether it's your economics, whether it's your social frameworks or your religion, and more, nothing is outside of the impact of neoliberalism and the players behind it, which are actually driving it. So I think, of course, in future
if I can just come in,
sure,
just very briefly, we should remember that we've been here before. We've been here before. 100 years ago, in 1920, our grandparents were in a far worse position. In 1820, they had the feudal barons to deal with. In 1920, you had rampant imperialism and capitalism everywhere. Workers had no rights. You know, we had workhouses and all sorts of things. So the key thing is in understanding our history that these things can change. But the notion that they will change because those in power will willingly let them change isn't.
Thank you. And on that note, I think it's very clear that change has to be one. Rights are not going to be given to you because you deserve them. They're going to be given if you actually fight for them. Thank you for watching this edition of The Deep Dive Perspective. Do hit that like button, share, and also subscribe to the channel so that we can, of course, make more programs and reach more people. As simple as that. We need to get these countercultural, counter-political narratives out far and wide. Thank you to Khalid Mahmood-Chohan, and thank you to Joao Silva Jordao as well in Lisbon. Until the next edition, goodbye.